We are delighted that you're with us again today for our Bible class. We're talking about the problem of human suffering. I don't need to remind you that everyone has problems, but I've tried to emphasize the fact that sometimes problems can be good for us, and God can use them for good in our lives. Let me just ask you a question to begin with. Do you know who invented high heel shoes for women? I have read that it was a young lady, short young lady, who was always being kissed on the forehead, and she needed to be raised up about 4 inches. Now, I can't vouch for the truthfulness of that explanation, but it helps us to understand that sometimes problems can work for our good. In summary, then, may I suggest 5 ways that God uses problems to bless our lives. Number 1, God uses problems to direct us. In Proverbs 30 and 20, Solomon suggested, David suggested, in Psalm 119, verse 71, David said, "It is good for me that I have been afflicted, that I might learn thy statutes." David had been going in the wrong direction, and God allowed some suffering to come into his life to cause him to change direction in his life. God uses problems sometimes to inspect us. In James chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, James says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing." Now, God sometimes inspects us by allowing this suffering to come into our lives, and he sees where we need to grow and develop, and so he can help us grow, and it gives us patience sometimes to go through some suffering. God uses troubles sometimes to correct us. In Hebrews chapter 12, verses 6 through 10, we have noted that God sometimes allows man to suffer to discipline him, to correct him. He's been doing something wrong, and suffering comes and it causes him to correct his life. God sometimes uses trouble to protect us. In the book of Genesis, we noted the study of Joseph. In the first lesson in this series, we talked about the way in which Joseph suffered in many ways, and God allowed that suffering to come into Joseph's life and directed those things so it would permit Joseph to be in a position to protect the nation of Israel from starvation. God sometimes allows pain and suffering to help us and protect us. I've seen it in my own life. Back when I was still preaching full-time, after over half a century of preaching, my body began to be in a little trouble. I was having pain in my chest. I went to a cardiologist. She had me go through a heart cath, and she said, "The results show that you have 3 blockages. You need to have 3 stents put into the arteries of your heart." So I went into the hospital, and the doctor carried me into the operating room, intending to put in 3 stents. She put in 4 stents, and then I was brought back into the recovery room. And by that time, I was awake, and my wife had come into the room with me, and I was having pain in my chest. My wife went to the nurse in charge in the recovery room and told her that I was having pain, and the nurse said, "Don't worry about it, that's a normal thing." So my wife came back to my bed, and I was getting worse, and she went back to the nurse and told her I was hurting more. And the nurse said, "Don't worry about it, he's all right." And my wife came back to the bed where I was, and I was hurting even more. I was writhing in pain. I was moving, couldn't keep still. And my wife went back to the nurse and begged her to check me. And the nurse said, "Okay, I'll check him." And she did an EKG and found out that I was having a heart attack. I had been brought out of the into the recovery room, and I was having a heart attack. They rushed me back into the operating room, and the doctor put in 4 more stents. Now, that was 8 stents altogether I had put into my heart arteries. Now, I'm glad that I had that pain. If I had not had that pain, they would not have known that I was having a heart attack. It was a serious one. It damaged my heart. And if I had not had that pain, I could have died. Later, my regular doctor told me the Lord was watching over me. he realized how serious it was and could have been. But you see, God can use suffering sometimes and problems and pain to protect us. I believe that was an example of it. Then number 5, God uses problems sometimes to perfect us. In the book of Romans, chapter 5, verses 3 and 4, Paul talked about that very fact. And not only so, but we glory in tribulations. Can you imagine glorying or rejoicing in tribulations? There's a reason for it. Knowing that tribulation worketh patience, and patience experience, and experience hope. So you see, suffering can cause us to be aware of things and do something about them, and it can help us to grow and develop, and it causes patience, experience, and then gives us hope. So sometimes God allows suffering to come upon us for our own good. These are 5 ways in which God uses suffering to bless our lives: to direct us, to inspect us, to correct us, to protect us, and to perfect us. Now, there are 3 lessons that I would like to emphasize this morning. I'd like for you to try to remember these. This is a summary of some things that we've talked about. Number 1, dreary days are temporary. They don't last forever. In Proverbs 30 and verse 5, Solomon said, "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning." We may be sick some night, we may not feel good, but then we go to bed and in the morning we're feeling fine. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, beginning with verse 16, that these problems and pains that we experience here on earth are not forever. He said, "For our light affliction, which is but for a moment." Now, how can these sufferings that Paul had experienced be light afflictions and only for a moment? Paul tells us that the things that we see are temporary, but the things which we don't see are eternal. And so he points us toward heaven and toward eternal things. Paul was thinking about things eternal. His mind was upon heaven and heavenly things. And that helped him to realize that these sufferings on earth are not long-lasting. They are only temporary. In fact, he calls them a light affliction. And so in Colossians 3, 1 and 2, Paul said, "If ye then be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above. Set your affections on things above and not on things of this earth." And so if we can try to set our affections upon things above, if we think about heaven and heavenly things, it will help us to realize that these problems on earth are only temporary. Even if they last the rest of our lives, they're still only temporary compared to eternity. Now in Revelation 21 and 4, John describes heaven by saying, "And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. There shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away." So if we can think about heaven and heavenly things, it will help us to see that these problems on earth are only temporary. Then number 2, loads do not have to be carried all at the same time. You see, we can think about today's problems and probably handle them all right. But if we think about tomorrow's problems and the problems for next year and the rest of our lives, they can become too heavy for us. I read a fable about a grandfather clock that decided to stop running and ticking when it heard someone say that in 90 years, it would tick 2,828,240,000 times. When he thought of all of that, it was just overwhelming, and he decided not to tick anymore. I know grandfather clocks don't normally talk, but these did. And when he heard someone say, "You only have to do it 1 tick at a time," that's where we ought to live, just 1 tick at a time. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 34, "Take no thought for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof." In other words, don't worry about tomorrow and the problems for tomorrow. Just live for today. Now, suppose you ladies should think about all the dishes you have to wash the rest of your life. And I should say gentlemen too, because I know there are men like me. I run things in my house. The dishwasher, vacuum cleaner, washing machine. There are many other men who do that. So I should say, I guess, those of you who wash dishes don't need to think about all the dishes you'll have to wash the rest of your life. That would be overwhelming. But think only about the dishes that you're going to wash today. And so it is with these problems and sufferings of life. We don't need to carry all those burdens today. We just need to live for today. As Jesus said, take no thought for tomorrow. Don't worry about tomorrow. And then number 3, there is someone who is aware of your problems today, and he loves you. He's concerned about you. In Matthew chapter 10, verses 29 through 31, Jesus gave some important teaching for us on this point. He said, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing, and one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father?" Now, sparrows are almost worthless birds. Jesus said you can buy 2 of them for 1 farthing. Now, if you get 2 for 1 farthing, how many sparrows would you get for 2 farthing? You would expect to get 4. But in Luke chapter 12 and verse 6, Jesus said, "Are not 5 sparrows sold for a farthing?" How do you explain that? Well, if you buy 4 for 2 farthing, you get an extra one thrown in free. They are of such little value, you get 5 when you buy 4. Now, Jesus is teaching us that sparrows are not worth very much, but not one of them can fall on the ground without your Father's notice. He's concerned about each one. In the next verse, he said, "The very hairs of your head are all numbered." Now, some of us may say, well, in my head, that wouldn't be a great feat. But with many people, it would be a big feat. How would God know about how many hairs you're going to have in your head for all the people of the world? God is concerned about each one. And his conclusion is, in verse 31, "Fear ye not, therefore, for ye are of more value than many sparrows." If God is concerned about a little sparrow that's almost worthless, surely he's concerned about you and me. That's why Peter says in 1 Peter 5 and 7, "Casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you." God cares for us, and we can go to him in prayer and tell God about them. Do you remember that song we used to sing in our worship quite often? What a friend we have in Jesus. All our sins and griefs to bear. What a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer. Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear. All because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. Sometimes we don't pray. We don't go to God and ask him to help us with those problems. And then sometimes we go to God and talk to him in prayer about those problems, but then we don't leave them with him. Do you remember that story I told you about the lady who had 5 little children? If you remember it, please don't stop me. Let me tell it again because it illustrates this point so well. There was a lady who had 5 young children, and her children were playing in her yard one day, and she went over to a neighbor's house to visit with the lady next door for a few minutes. When she came back, she saw her children all huddled in a circle. They were playing with something in the middle of them. As she came nearer, she saw that they were playing with baby skunks. Now, she didn't know if those baby skunks could spray those children as an adult skunk could do, but she knew if they could, they'd be ruined, and she'd almost have to throw them away and start over. So she said to her children, "Children, run." And each of her children grabbed a little baby skunk and ran. Isn't that how we deal with our problems sometimes? We go to God in prayer, we talk to him about those problems, and then we get through praying, we pick them up and carry them off with us. Peter says, casting all your cares upon him. We need to go to God in prayer, tell him about those problems, and then leave them with him. And so these 3 points, I think, should help us learn to live with our problems and realize that God sometimes uses them to bless our lives. Now I'd like for us to shift gears a little bit and turn to another area, another aspect of this suffering problem. What are the broad or general areas in which we suffer? I have noted that I believe we suffer physically, mentally or emotionally, and spiritually. Those are general areas in which we suffer. Now let's zero in on physical suffering and think about some of the ways in which we suffer physically. The first thing that comes to mind is physical suffering in sickness. Now, sooner or later, all of us will be afflicted with this illness in some kind of way. Sooner or later, all of us will suffer with sickness. Some illnesses are very serious, others are not so serious. Think about some serious illnesses of the past. Think of the plague in Europe back in the 14th century, when 1/3 of the population died in that plague. It was called the Black Death. Very serious thing. 1/3 of the population died. Think of the flu that we had here in America in 1918. Many people died. Most of us had known very little about that flu, but during this present problem, we've seen pictures from that period of time. There was a big building with beds right next to each other, like a big auditorium, and there were many people who were sick with the flu. Some sicknesses are more serious than others. Some are not very serious. We can have a cold, and that wouldn't be a very big problem with us. Now, we bear some responsibility for getting well when we're sick. We are to do our part. Jesus said in Matthew 9 and verse 12, "They that are whole need not a physician, but they that are sick." Jesus is saying that if we're sick, we need to see a doctor. We need to use good judgment and see a doctor. Now, there are some folks who just don't go to doctors. They don't like to, but they can't expect God to bless them and help them in some way if they don't do what they can do. There is some illness that we can change. Doctors can help us. We have appendicitis, we can have surgery and have the appendix taken out, and we can get well. We may have strep throat, and the doctor can give us some antibiotics, and we can get well. There are some illnesses that they can help, and we need to do what we can. There is some physical illness that we cannot change. Remember Paul's thorn in the flesh, 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10. He prayed to God and asked him to remove it, but God said no. Paul needed to have that illness to keep him humble and realize that he was dependent upon God. Now, there are some illnesses for which we are responsible. We can avoid some things if we live for God and don't participate in some things that will bring illnesses to us. And there are some illnesses for which we're not responsible. They just happen because of various things, as we've noted in our study thus far. Just by living here on earth, we're going to have some illnesses, some problems, some suffering. One's baby may die. They die because of some heart condition. And some people may think God did that, but I don't believe God did. That baby is not responsible for that illness. That is something that happens. Older people can die. Younger people, even young babies can die. Just because they live on earth, they run into some of this suffering. Now, when we are sick, we need to do what we can, go to doctors, take medicine, take some time. And we cannot expect God to heal us miraculously as He healed people miraculously in the first century. There are some in our day and in past generations who have said they could heal people miraculously. Benny Hinn in our present day, the late Oral Roberts, believed that they were faith healers. They were not faith healers, they were fake healers. No one today can miraculously heal other people as the apostles did in the first century. Now, the miracles of the first century were for a purpose. God had given these apostles the truth to preach in a miraculous way, and He had to give them the ability to perform miracles to convince people that they were speaking for God. So in Mark 16, verse 20, the Bible tells us that these miracles were to confirm the Word. When the Word of God was given in its completeness and then confirmed with miracles, There was no further need for the miracles, and they ceased after that first period of time. Now, someone may say, then you don't believe in divine healing, do you? I do believe in divine healing. I believe that all healing is divine. I believe that God heals people when it is His will. But I do not believe in miraculous healing today by any man. God doesn't use men today and work miracles through them to heal people. God does heal us. He does it providentially. He does it by using the ordinary laws of nature. He can heal people through doctors, through medicine, through time. God does it providentially. The Cecil May has written a book on providence. You would do well to get that book and read it. And you can understand then the difference between providence and the miraculous. God works today providentially through the laws of nature to help us and make us well. We cannot expect God today to work through men to heal us miraculously. We need to do what we can as we can. Now, some people are suffering today with illnesses that are tragic, such as dementia in some way. And they haven't found any cure for that yet. Hopefully that will happen one day. But some people are suffering tragically with some form of dementia. And so illness is one of the ways in which we suffer physically. And we're taught that we can pray about them, take them to the Lord in prayer, leave them with Him. Now, today, we also suffer death. And this is a common thing, and we're seeing a great deal of it at the present time. People can suffer through death. We Americans don't like to talk about death. We use euphemisms sometimes to refer to various things connected with death. Think of these euphemisms: mortuaries, slumber rooms, sleeping, the deceased, interment. We use euphemisms because they're softened forms of the real thing. I remember hearing of a farmer who didn't want to talk about somebody dying, so he used the words passed on. He said he had 2 passed on mules. Some people get hung up on using that expression, and they find it difficult to say someone died or something died, and they say it passed on. The universal statistic is the same. We all do. There's 1 out of 1 that dies. In Hebrews 9:27, the universal law was given. It is appointed unto men once to die, but after this, the judgment. Now, the general rule is that people are going to die, and we can't put that off. We can't delay it. We can't ward off death. Old age cannot ward off death. If it could, Methuselah would not have died. Yet he died. Wisdom cannot ward off death. If it could, Solomon would not have died. Physical strength cannot ward off death. If it could, Samson would not have died. Righteousness cannot ward off death. If it could, Abraham and thousands of others of God's people would not have died. And so the universal statistic is the same. 1 out of 1 does. Now, there have been 2 exceptions in the past. For various reasons, known only to God, 2 people did not die. Enoch and Elijah were translated that they should not see death. But death and decay are written upon every living thing, vegetable, human, or animal, and life will die. Now, the Bible teaches, I believe, that there will some who will be still living when Christ comes again. I don't believe they will die. In 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 13 through 19, Paul dealt with that very problem. He said, "Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds, and we shall see the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord." So there are some people who will still be living when Christ comes again, and so they won't die, but they will be taken up to meet Him in the air. The Bible never tries to gloss over this matter of death. It does not try to cover up the fact that we are going to die. For example, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, in the first few verses, Solomon talked about the fact that there's a time for everything. Time to be born, and a time to die. And so death is something with which all of us will be familiar at some time in our lives. Now, I know that there is a sting involved in death. There is some suffering involved with it. Paul talked about that sting of death in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 56. The sting of death is sin. Now, the sting of death has led many in our generation to use every technological means it can to ward off death and outwit death. We've even started using spare parts in people. We've known for a long time that if some part of your car stops working, you don't have to throw the car away. You can get a spare part and put into it, and it can keep on going. We've learned to do that with human beings. If the heart wears out, a new one can be put in. Lungs can be transplanted. In fact, I read just 2 or 3 days ago that during this present pandemic, there was a person up in Indiana, I believe, whose lungs had been damaged by this present virus, and the doctors did a double lung transplant. So we've learned to put spare parts into people, trying to help them live longer. Now, the Christian can face death and face it properly with the right attitude. He can have confidence in God and in the promises of God. In John chapter 14, verses 1 through 3, Jesus spoke to his apostles and tried to remove their fears because he had told them that he was going to go away and they were troubled. He said, "Let not your hearts be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also." Jesus was trying to remove some of the fear that would be in the apostles. In 1 Corinthians 11, or rather John 11, and verse 25, Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live." And so Jesus promises that even though we die, we shall live again. That ought to give us hope and confidence, even though we know we're going to die. Some years ago, I was preaching for the Concord Street Church in Orlando, Florida, and we had a lady in the congregation, an elderly lady who had cancer, and she was going to have to undergo surgery. There was a possibility that she might not live through surgery, and there was the possibility that they might not be able to get all of the cancer out, and cancer still might take her life. I went to the hospital the night before she was to have surgery to visit with her and encourage her and try to comfort her. But she encouraged me and comforted me. She was calm and contented, and she had a good attitude. She was resigned to accept whatever would come. She said, "I wouldn't say that I'm sorry that I had cancer, because it had helped me. I have gained far more than I have lost." There was someone who was a faithful Christian. She had confidence. She had security. She wasn't afraid to die. And she had learned some lessons from suffering with cancer. We too can have that kind of faith, and we can overcome our fear of death. In Psalm 23, verse 4, in the beautiful Shepherd's Psalm, David, the sweet singer of Israel, said, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." David was not afraid to walk through that dark valley because he knew that God would walk with him. And God will walk with us as well when we face that dark valley. In Philippians 1, verse 21, Paul said, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." He didn't say that to die is a loss or a tragedy, but to die is gain. When one is a faithful Christian and he comes to death, death for him is not a tragedy, it is a blessing. In verse 23, Paul said, "For I am in a strait betwixt two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you." Paul had a desire to go to be with Christ, but he knew it would be better if he could stay here on earth and preach to those people and give them the hope of going to heaven after a while. And so the death for a faithful Christian is not a tragic death. The only tragedy is to die outside of Christ. If a person dies without Christ, death is indeed a tragedy. Though death is a part of living upon earth, many people have not understood that, and sometimes they blame God when they die. And if they had been Christians and understood the Bible teaching on death, then they would not be blaming God for it. Some even say when the baby dies, "Why did God take my baby?" But God didn't take that baby. Death is a part of living on earth, and it can come to those who are older, it can come to those who are younger, even newborn babies. Remember that we cannot see the end result of death or any kind of suffering. If we could see the end result, we might have a different picture of it. I'm thinking of a man that I met a number of years ago. There's a congregation for which I had preached in 6 meetings, and in one of those earlier meetings, a man in the congregation told me about his daughter. At that present time, she was not a faithful Christian. She was living in the world. And that father knew that if she should die in that condition, she would be lost. He told me that when his daughter was young, she was faithful. And then when she graduated from college, she went to David Lipscomb College. At that time, it was safe to send your children to David Lipscomb. And she was a faithful Christian while there. She dropped out of school and came back home. Then he said she fell in with the wrong crowd. And she began to be like the people with whom she was running. She departed from the Lord and was living an unfaithful life. And he acknowledged the fact that if she should die right then in that condition, she probably would be lost. And he made a statement to me that I remember to this day. He said, "I would to God my daughter had died when she was at Lipscomb." He meant that if his daughter had died back then when she was a faithful Christian, it would not be a tragedy, it would have been a blessing for her. Because later, she departed from the Lord, and a death during that period of time would be a tragedy indeed. Death can bring suffering and sorrow, even when good people die. I've had that experience, and you have had that experience. When my mother-in-law died in 2010, at the age of 93, it hurt me deeply, though she was my mother-in-law. At that time, I couldn't think of any mother-in-law jokes that would apply to her. Most of them are negative. But she was a faithful Christian for more than 80 years of her life. One of the finest persons that I have ever met. And so it hurt me deeply when she died. And I understand that when you have loved ones to die, it can hurt you as well. Death can help us, though, get our priorities right. I have known people who were not living for the Lord, and then when some loved one died or someone close to them died, it caused them to consider themselves and where they would spend eternity. I'm thinking of a man right now who was not a Christian. Then someone close to him died, and it shook him to the depths of his soul. He gave me an opportunity to work with him and talk with him and teach him. He obeyed the gospel of Christ, and that's been nearly 20 years ago. And he is today one of the most faithful and active members of that congregation. So death sometimes can serve to encourage us to do better. Sometimes it can help us. Death can help us get our priorities in order. Death can be a release from suffering too. When I was preaching for the Dalrata Church, I conducted approximately 100 funerals. And in many cases, I believe that death for the person who had died was really a blessing for that person. That person had been suffering greatly here on earth with a physical disease. But then when they died, it released that person from that suffering. I believe that was true with this poor man, Lazarus, in Luke 16, 19 through 31. Lazarus was hungry. He would have eaten the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. He had sores all over his body. And then he died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. I believe that death for Lazarus was a blessing. When a person is a faithful Christian now, He may suffer here on earth, and when he dies, it can be a blessing for him. Not for his loved ones. They'll be filled with sorrow and heartache. But for that person, it could be a blessing. Now, sometimes people have not lost their humor, even in regard to death. I heard about an old maid who died and left some instructions for her funeral. Now, normally I should refer to her as an unclaimed blessing, but so you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. This lady was an old maid. She had never married, and she left some instructions about her funeral. She said in those instructions, "I don't want any man to serve as a pallbearer for my funeral. They never would take me out while I was alive, and I don't want them to take me out after I'm dead." She hadn't lost her humor, even in the face of death. I remember hearing of the death of a man up in Minnesota. His name was Pease, spelled P-E-A-S, like garden peas. And he left some instructions for his funeral and for an epitaph to be placed upon his grave. And this epitaph said, "This ain't peas, it's only the pod. Peas been shelled and gone to God." His humor was still with him. And that teaches a good lesson. This body is just the pod. The real pea is on the inside. The pea's been shelled and gone to God. Death is one of the ways in which people suffer. Sometimes they suffer sickness and then die. Sometimes their friends and loved ones suffer after they die. But God can help us and bless us through all of that suffering. When we come to the end of life's way, when we've served God faithfully, we can say with the Apostle Paul, "For I'm now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand. I've fought a good fight, I've finished the course, I've kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give to me in that day, and not to me only, but unto all them also that love his appearing." You too can have that hope and security that Paul had. I hope you'll be with us next week as we continue our study of human suffering. Shall we close with prayer? Holy Father in heaven, we are thankful for the promises of your word. We're thankful that though we die, we shall live again. We're thankful for the hope that we can live in heaven with you, where all tears will be wiped away. Bless us, we pray, as we try to make preparation for that time. Help us to be faithful Christians and have that hope that Paul had. Bless us and keep us, we pray, in your care. In the name of Christ, amen.